Alright, so following on from the brain and cranial nerves, this lecture is going to focus on the spinal cord and spinal nerves. To start off with, we'll look at the internal and external anatomy of the spinal cord, as well as a spinal nerve. We will cover the major sensory pathways and the major motor pathways of the body. We will describe what makes a reflex, the components of a reflex, and then take a look at some examples. So starting off with learning objective number 1, which is describe the internal and external anatomy of the spinal cord. So alongside the brain, the spinal cord makes up the central nervous system. The spinal cord is roughly oval in shape, and in adults, it extends from the medulla oblongata, which remember is the most inferior part of the brainstem, down to the top of the second lumbar vertebra. During early childhood, both the spinal cord and the vertebral column will grow longer as part of overall body growth as the child gets bigger. However, the elongation of the spinal cord actually stops at about age 4 or 5, whereas the growth of the vertebral column will continue. What this means is that the spinal cord doesn't actually extend the entire length of the adult spine. The length of the adult spine ranges from about 42 to 45 centimetres, with a maximum diameter of 1.5 centimetres in the lower cervical region. Now, like the brain, the tissue of the spinal cord is very delicate and it does not respond well to injury or damage. Accordingly, the spinal cord has a number of protective structures in place to ensure that doesn't happen. Like the brain, the spinal cord is encased in a hard bony layer of the vertebral column, so it protects from any external bumps or blows. So this is like the skull to the brain. And also just like the brain, the spinal cord is completely surrounded by 3 layers of meninges. These meninges lie between the vertebral column and the spinal cord. The meninges that enclose the spinal cord are continuous with those that surround the brain, and they cover the entire spinal cord to the point where our spinal nerves exit. So these yellow structures are our spinal nerves. The meninges don't cover those. That is where the meningeal cover will end. As a bit of a brief recap from superficial to deep, these 3 layers of meninges are our dura mater, our arachnoid mater, and our pia mater. So our dura mater was that tough leathery layer. Our arachnoid mater was a spiderweb-like layer, and our pia mater was that really thin, transparent layer that adheres directly to the surface of the spinal cord. Within the pia mater, we have blood vessels that supply oxygen and nutrients to the spinal cord. And in between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater, we have that subarachnoid spate, which contains that shock-absorbing cerebrospinal fluid. So looking at the external of the spinal cord, and as I said, the spinal cord extends from the medulla oblongata down to about the top of the second lumbar vertebra. So this is our spinal cord here. Spinal nerves exiting that spinal cord can go lower in the vertebral column, but not the actual spinal cord itself. Viewing the spinal cord in this posterior view, you can see that 2 enlargements of the spinal cord are quite apparent. This top one here, so see how this top section is a little bit thicker than the rest of the spinal cord? This is what we call the cervical or cervical enlargement. This thickening is where the spinal nerves for our upper limbs will exit and enter. The lower enlargement, so this thicker region here, is what we call the lumbar enlargement. And nerves to and from our lower limbs arise from this lumbar enlargement. Taking a look at the internal anatomy of the spinal cord, and here we have a transverse section. We have an inner region of grey matter, kind of looks a little bit like a butterfly or like the letter H. We then have an outer layer of white matter. In the centre of our grey matter, we have this little hole here, which is our central canal. It extends the entire length of the spinal cord. and is filled with our cerebrospinal fluid. So remember, our cerebrospinal fluid is produced in the ventricles in our brain. It runs through the ventricles down into the central canal, along the spinal cord, through the central canal, then on the outside into that subarachnoid space where it goes on the outside of the spinal cord, and then up into the brain. As a recap on our grey and our white matter, our grey matter consists of dendrites, of cell bodies of neurons, as well as unmyelinated axons. Our white matter, which is this lighter colour here, consists of only myelinated axons. So that myelin is what gives it that white colour. Now, the grey matter in the spinal cord is subdivided into what we call horns. So the posterior horn, which is this one here and this one here, contains cell bodies and axons of interneurons. So this purple part here is an interneuron. It's between our sensory neuron and our motor neuron. It also has the axons of our incoming sensory neurons. The cell bodies of our sensory neurons are located in this posterior root ganglion of a spinal nerve. A ganglion is a collection of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. The anterior horns, so we've got one here and one here, contain the cell bodies of our motor neurons. So this is a motor neuron here taking information from the central nervous system out into the peripheral nervous system. And these provide nerve impulses for the contraction of our skeletal muscle. In between our posterior and our anterior horns, we have a lateral horn. So that is this little section here and also this section here. We only have lateral horns in our thoracic and our lumbar segments of the spinal cord. So where we have those cervical and lumbar enlargements. And these lateral horns contain cell bodies for our autonomic motor neurons. So they regulate the activity of cardiac muscle, of smooth muscle, of glands. The contraction that we don't need to think about. Now, like our grey matter, our white matter is also divided up into different regions. We call these different regions columns. So we have the anterior column, which is this section here. We have the posterior column, which is this part here. And then we have two lateral columns, so one here and one here. Now, each column contains a bundle of axons, of myelinated axons, that have a common origin or destination and are carrying similar information. These bundles of axons within the central nervous system, we call them tracts. So within the peripheral nervous system, it's a nerve, so for example, our spinal nerve. Within the central nervous system, so the brain or the spinal cord, we call these tracts. Tracts consisting of axons carrying nerve impulses from the brain to an effector, so from up downwards, we call our motor or our descending tracts because they descend down from the brain. Our tracts consisting of axons carrying nerve impulses from our receptors to the brain are called our sensory or our ascending tracts because they're ascending this information up towards the brain. I also wanted to point out that just in the brain and the spinal cord, anatomy uses the term ventral to describe anterior and dorsal to describe posterior. So how I remember these terms is the dorsal fin on a shark is the fin on the back. So dorsal means posterior. I am happy for you to use whichever term works for you, whether you want to stay consistent and use anterior and posterior, or whether you would like to use ventral and dorsal. Both are correct, but just stick with one and do what works for you. And lastly, just looking at the internal anatomy of different segments of the spinal cord, I just wanted to point out that they do vary in size, in shape, in the amounts of grey and white matter and how that grey matter and white matter is actually distributed. So as an example, the amount of grey matter is largest in our cervical and our lumbar segments of the spinal cord. And so remember, this is where we have those enlargements of the spinal cord because we have the innervation to our arms and our legs. So we have lots of neurons synapsing in these regions. You can also see that the diameter of the spinal cord decreases as it heads down towards your feet. The reason for that is the cervical region is going to have all of the motor neurons and all of the sensory neurons for your entire body. As we move downwards, some of those are going to leave to innervate their muscles and have the sensory information coming back from their receptors. So they leave as we go downwards, meaning there's a lot less of this white matter in the sacral region compared to the cervical region. So next we'll move on to a spinal nerve, and learning objective number 2 is to describe the anatomy of a spinal nerve. So spinal nerves are just the nerves that enter or exit the spinal cord. Spinal nerves connect sensory receptors to the central nervous system and the central nervous system to the effectors. We have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and they're pairs because they exit the spinal cord on both the left and the right, so one going in each direction. And they are named and numbered according to the region and the level of the vertebral column from which they emerge. So the first pair of spinal nerves emerge from the spinal cord between the occipital bone, so the base of the skull, and the atlas, which is our first cervical vertebra. The remaining spinal nerves emerge from the spinal cord through the intervertebral foramina between our adjoining vertebra. So you can see here, each of those spinal nerves is named with a letter relating to the cervical or the thoracic or the sacral region, and the number vertebra from which they exit from. So taking a bit of a closer look at a single spinal nerve, which also has the same makeup of a cranial nerve or a tract in the central nervous system. And you can see in this image here that each nerve is made up of lots of individual axons. So here we have one axon of one neuron, and they are surrounded by lots of different layers of connective tissue. So starting at the very smallest component of a nerve, I said we have our axon. And our axons are surrounded by an endoneurium. So a single axon is surrounded by an endoneurium. Endo refers to within. Groups of axons are then held together in bundles called fascicles. So you can hear there's lots of different axons surrounded by endoneurium. That group of axons is now called a fascicle. Our fascicles are surrounded by a perineurium. So another connective tissue layer called the perineurium, and peri means around. The outermost covering of the entire nerve is what we call the epineurium. So epi refers to the outer layer or being on top of other layers, and it surrounds groups of fascicles. So from smallest to largest, we have axons surrounded by an endoneurium. We have a fascicle, which are bundles of axons surrounded by a perineurium. And then we have groups of fascicles surrounded by an epineurium, which then makes up our spinal nerve. So taking a look at where the spinal nerve enters and exits the spinal cord, and we have what we call a posterior route, which is this one here and this one here, and an anterior route. So that's this one here and this one here. The posterior route is always easy to identify because the cell bodies of our sensory neurons, which are unipolar neurons, and they have that cell body which kind of sits off to the side of the axon, and the cell body sits in our ganglion. So remember, ganglion are a collection of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So you should always be able to identify the sensory nerve and the posterior root, because it will have this ganglion sitting just next to the spinal cord. The posterior root carries our sensory information from our receptors into the spinal cord. Our anterior root carries the motor information from the spinal cord out to an effector. Here, so this is where our intervertebral foramen would sit, where that posterior root and anterior root unite, is now what we call our spinal nerve. So when those two unite at the region of the intervertebral foramina, we now call this section our spinal nerve. Now, all spinal nerves are classified as mixed nerves because they will have one axon, or at least one axon, from a sensory neuron and at least one axon from a motor neuron. Now, a short distance after passing through that intervertebral foramen or foramina, a spinal nerve will divide into several more branches. These branches are known as rami or ramus as the singular. So we have a posterior ramus, which serves or innervates the deep muscles and the skin of the posterior surface of the trunk, so the back of your body. The anterior ramus serves the muscles and structures of the upper and lower limbs, as well as the skin on the side and the front surfaces of your body. In addition to our posterior and anterior ramus, we also have a meningeal branch. And this branch actually re-enters the vertebral canal through the intervertebral foramen, and it supplies the vertebra, the vertebral ligaments, and blood vessels of the spinal cord and meninges. So all of those structures actually need innervation, and this meningeal branch is what innervates those structures. So if we take a look at each of those structures, we have our spinal cord here, our posterior root, because remember our posterior root has our ganglion. Our anterior root is here. Where those two unite, just outside of that intervertebral foramen, is now our spinal nerve. We have our posterior ramus branching off here. So that's going to innervate our deep muscles and the skin on the posterior surface of the trunk. We have our anterior ramus. So that's innervating the muscles of the upper and the lower limbs, so our arms and our legs, as well as the skin on the side and front of our body. And then this little section here is our meningeal branch, and you can see that comes back into the intervertebral foramen and then innervates those structures in there. Now, continuing along that spinal nerve, so it's branched into those different rami, the anterior rami does not then go directly to the body structures that it innervates. Instead, they form networks of nerves by joining with various other axons from other anterior rami of adjacent nerves. This network of nerves that they form is what we call a plexus. So a plexus down here. We have four principal plexuses. So we have a cervical plexus, a brachial plexus, a lumbar plexus, and a sacral plexus. We don't have a thoracic plexus because these nerves actually do connect directly to the structures that they innervate. This is just because they're in the intercostal space region, so nice and close to the spinal cord. We also have a smaller coccygeal plexus, but it's quite small, so it's not always noted in anatomy textbooks. Now, emerging from the plexuses are nerves that are named for the general regions that they serve or the path along the body that they take. And then each of those nerves may in turn have several branches named for the specific structures that they innervate. So if we have a look here, these are the anterior rami from each of these nerves. So for example, this is the C5 nerve, or the nerve, the spinal nerve that exits below the fifth cervical vertebra. It exits branches off into the anterior rami. It then joins C6, C7, C8, and T1 and 2 to become a plexus. So here, see how they will join one nerve, it will branch again, it will join again, it will branch again. This area in here is what we call a plexus. So it's a nice big branching network of nerves. They will then separate off again, and we will have the nerves that serve particular regions. So here we have our ulnar nerve, so it runs down the lower arm. We have, say, our auxiliary nerve. Auxiliary is referring to our underarm, so this would serve the underarm region. And then we'll have specific nerves that serve specific body structures. Now, lastly, when we're looking at spinal nerves, and here we're thinking about the sensory portion of a spinal nerve. So the entire body is supplied by sensory neurons that carry nerve impulses from the skin to the spinal cord and the brain. Each spinal nerve contains sensory neurons that serve a particular area of the body. The area of the skin that contains the receptors that provide that sensory input for one cranial nerve is called a dermatome. So D-E-R-M-A-T-O-M-E, dermatome. So each dermatome is represented in this image here. So for example, the back of your head, this is a dermatome for C2. Only this area will travel along this spinal nerve to the brain. Down here we have the dermatome, or the region that is innervated by the sensory neurons for S1. So all of the receptors, all of the information going from the receptors along with sensory neurons will only go into this S1 spinal nerve. Learning objective number 3 is to list and describe the major sensory pathways, our major somatic sensory pathways. So remembering our somatic senses relate to our body. So that includes things like touch, pressure, pain, temperature, and stretch, but not taste, smell, hearing, vision, and equilibrium. So those are our special senses. So it's all the other senses except for our special senses. So a major function of the spinal cord is obviously to transmit information. We take sensory information from a receptor and transmit it up towards the brain via a ascending or a sensory neural pathway. We then have motor information that arises in the brain, and we transmit down the spinal cord along a descending or a motor neural pathway. In this image here, the sections of the spinal cord are highlighted in either red or blue to denote either the sensory or the ascending tracts, or the motor or the descending tracts. So in a tract, we'll have all of the bundles of axons of a particular type of information. Regarding the major sensory and motor pathways or motor tracts, the name of the tract indicates its position in the white matter and where it begins and where it ends. As an example, we have our anterior corticospinal tract. This is a motor tract. It's located in the anterior white column, so that's this section here. And it begins in the cerebral cortex and ends in the spinal cord, so corticospinal. So our somatic sensory pathways relay information from our somatic sensory receptors up to the primary somatosensory area in the cerebral cortex. We also have some information that goes from our receptors to the cerebellum. The neural pathways that go from the receptors to the primary somatosensory area consist of thousands of sets of 3 neurons. So a first order neuron, a second order neuron, and a third order neuron. The neural pathways that go from the receptors to the cerebellum consist of sets of 2 neurons, just a first order neuron and a second order neuron. So a first order neuron is simply the first neuron in that neural pathway. and they conduct impulses from a receptor to the spinal cord or the brainstem. Information from receptors of the face, the mouth, the teeth, and the eyes propagate along our cranial nerves into our brainstem. Information from receptors of the neck, the trunk, the limbs, the back of the head, so basically back of the head down, propagate along our spinal nerves into our spinal cord. Our second order neurons conduct impulses from the spinal cord or the brainstem up to the thalamus. So remember, the thalamus was those two oval structures in the very center of the brain. The major function of the thalamus was to act as a relay station. So axons of our second order neurons decussate or cross over to reach the opposite side in the brainstem or the spinal cord before it reaches the thalamus. So it comes from one side of the body, goes up to the spinal cord or brainstem, it crosses to the other side, and then it synapses in the thalamus. This means that all of the sensory information from one side of the body actually reaches the other side of the brain. Our third order neurons conduct impulses from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory cortex or area of the cerebral cortex in the brain. And here it's on the same side, so same side of the thalamus to same side of the cortex. So taking a look at an example or a more real-life drawing of that process. So a somatic sensory neural pathway takes information from a receptor. So here we have a proprioceptor, which could be in our muscle, or a mechanoreceptor, say within our skin. It travels along a first order neuron into our spinal cord. Here we have our posterior root ganglion. So we know this is our posterior root. This then travels upwards on the same side of the body to our brainstem. Here we have our medulla oblongata. In the brainstem, that second order neuron decussates, so it crosses over to the other side of the body, or the other side of the brainstem, where it then ascends up to reach the thalamus. From the thalamus, we synapse with our third order neuron, and that information travels from the thalamus up to our primary somatosensory area or primary somatosensory cortex. Now, once this information reaches that primary somatosensory cortex, that's when this sensory information is actually perceived. So it allows us to be aware of that sensation. In our neural pathways that go from receptor to cerebellum, the first order neuron travels from the receptor to the spinal cord, and the second order neuron goes from spinal cord to the cerebellum. Some of these second order neurons decussate or cross over and reach the cerebellum on the opposite side. Others do not. So taking a look at the major sensory neural pathways, and there are 3 pathways that the somatic sensory impulses will take to reach the cerebral cortex, and there are 2 pathways that they'll take to reach the cerebellum. So the 3 pathways that go up to our primary somatosensory area in the cerebral cortex are our posterior column medial lemniscus, our anterior lateral, also called our spinothalamic tract, and our trigeminothalamic tract. These are all 3 neurons in that neural pathway. The pathways that our sensory impulses take to reach the cerebellum, which are made up of 2 neurons, are our anterior and our posterior spinocerebellar. So looking at each of those pathways in a little bit more detail, first we have our posterior column medial lemniscus tract. The name of the pathway comes from the 2 white matter tracts that transmit those sensory impulses. So they run through the posterior column of the spinal cord, the posterior column here, and then the medial lemniscus of the brainstem. So the medial lemniscus is this green spot here. First order neurons in the pathway extend from the receptors in the receptors out in the peripheral nervous system into the spinal cord, and then up to the medulla oblongata on the same side of the body. These axons form the posterior column. The axons of our second order neurons then cross to the other side of the body. They enter the medial lemniscus and they ascend up to the thalamus. In the thalamus, our second order neuron synapses with our third order neuron, and then it projects all the way up to our primary somatosensory cortex. So we have from receptors to medulla, it decussates in the medulla, ascends up to the thalamus, and then from thalamus to cerebral cortex. The anterior lateral or our spinothalamic tract transmits nerve impulses from receptors for nociception, which is pain, temperature, itch, and tickle from the limbs, trunk, neck, and posterior head. So basically back of the head downwards. The first order neuron connects to a receptor in the spinal cord. The axon of the second order neurons then decussate in the spinal cord, so they cross over to the opposite side. They then pass upward as a spinothalamic tract to the thalamus. And the third order neurons project from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex. Our trigeminothalamic tract transmits our nerve impulses for tactile, thermal, and nociceptive, or our pain sensations, from the face, nasal cavity, oral cavity, and teeth. Our first order neurons extend from the receptors in the pons. They extend from the receptors and they go into the pons via our trigeminal, hence the name, or our fifth cranial nerve. Some of our second order neurons will then decussate here in the pons and then go up to our thalamus. Others will actually go down to the medulla, decussate in the medulla, and then go up to form that trigeminothalamic tract and synapse in our thalamus. Our third order neurons then go from our thalamus to the primary somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex on the same side. So lastly, we have our spinocerebellar, which is our two neuron pathways with the information going up to our cerebellum. We have an anterior and a posterior tract, but we're actually going to combine them today and look at them as one. So the spinocerebellar tracts transmit sensory information from proprioceptors in the trunk and the lower limbs to the cerebellum. This information isn't always consciously perceived, meaning that we're not always aware of these sensations, but they are critical for things like our posture, our balance, and our coordination. So remember, our cerebellum is important for doing really precise, skilled, coordinated movements. So the first order neurons of the spinocerebellar tracts extend from the receptors to the spinal cord on the same side. The second order neurons extend from the spinal cord to the cerebellum on the same side. However, having said that, the second order neurons of the anterior spinocerebellar tract, so this side here, actually decussate in the spinal cord, so they cross over in the spinal cord. They go up towards the cerebellum and then they decussate again before reaching the cerebellum. So ending up on the same side, but there's two lots of decussation or crossing over. The second order neurons of our posterior spinocerebellar tracts simply go directly up to the same side of the cerebellum. So before we move on to learning objective number 4, what I would like you to know about those major sensory pathways are what type of sensations do each of those pathways transmit? Are they 2 or 3 order neurons? And things like, do they decussate? Where do they synapse? Same for learning objective number 4. So learning objective number 4 is to list and describe the major somatic motor pathways. What I would like you to understand for these is the name of the pathway, what muscles it innervates, and the general pathway of those tracks. So our motor or our descending neural pathways are mostly made up of two neurons, but instead of being called first and second order neurons like our sensory pathways, we actually refer to these neurons in a motor tract as either an upper motor neuron or a lower motor neuron. An upper motor neuron is responsible for integrating all the nerve impulses from the cerebral cortex and the primary motor cortex and initiating our voluntary movement. Our upper motor neurons extend mostly from that primary motor cortex and the cerebral cortex, as well as some other regions in the frontal lobe, to our regions in the brainstem or the spinal cord, where they then form the motor tracks. In the brainstem or the spinal cord, our upper motor neurons synapse with either an interneuron. So an interneuron is just a neuron between a sensory and a motor neuron, or they would synapse directly with a lower motor neuron. Our lower motor neuron is what actually innervates our skeletal muscle. This transmits the action potential to actually allow muscle contraction. Lower motor neurons that arise from the brainstem extend out through our cranial nerves to innervate the skeletal muscle of the face and the head. The lower motor neurons that arise from the spinal cord extend out through our spinal nerves to innervate the muscles of the limbs and the trunk. Damage to an upper motor neuron can cause things like muscle weakness, slowness of movement, overactive reflexes, and quite tight and stiff muscles. Damage to an upper motor neuron is typically a result of conditions like stroke, MS, cerebral palsy, and a traumatic brain injury. Symptoms of damage to a lower motor neuron are actually quite different. So we have things like flaccid paralysis, so where you have a loss of muscle tone, so your muscles are a bit floppy. You have irregular, uncoordinated contraction or like tremor of your muscles. You can get weakness in very distinct areas, and often the absence of a reflex. The most common causes of lower motor neuron injury is a trauma to a peripheral nerve, so that might sever or damage an axon and the message can't get through. There are also a number of viruses that will actually selectively attack the anterior grey horn of the spinal cord, so where our motor neurons will synapse. In conditions that affect our lower motor neurons, you typically see a lot of muscle wastage. Now, our somatic motor pathways can be further divided into what we call pyramidal and extrapyramidal tracts, also called our direct pathways and our indirect pathways. So our pyramidal tracts originate in the cerebral cortex, and they carry motor fibres to the brainstem and the spinal cord. They are responsible for the voluntary control of our skeletal muscles, of the body and the face. Functionally, our pyramidal tracts can be further divided into two different types of tracts. We have the corticospinal tracts, and we actually have an anterior and a lateral corticospinal tract. And these tracts will supply the muscles of the body. We then have a corticobulbar tract, and this supplies the muscles of the head and the neck. These tracts are called pyramidal tracts because they run through the medullary pyramids that sit on the front surface of the medulla oblongata. Our extrapyramidal tracts originate in the brainstem, so further down in the brain, and they carry motor fibres to the spinal cord. Here, they're important for our involuntary and automatic control of muscle. So things like controlling muscle tone, balance, posture, and some parts of locomotion. This is the muscle contraction that we don't need to think about. Functionally, the extrapyramidal tracts can be divided into four. We have the vestibulospinal, the reticulospinal, the rubrospinal, and the tectospinal tracts. The extrapyramidal tracts are called extrapyramidal because they do not pass through these medullary pyramids. So taking a look at the pyramidal tracts, which innervate the muscles which control the voluntary movement of our face and body, so they innervate our skeletal muscle. And we'll start with the corticospinal tract. And as I said, it can be further divided into a lateral and an anterior corticospinal tract. So the corticospinal tracts conduct nerve impulses for the control of muscles of the limbs and the trunk. About 90% of the corticospinal axons will decussate in the medulla and then descend into the spinal cord where they synapse with either an interneuron or a lower motor neuron. The remaining 10% will descend to the spinal cord on the same side and then decussate at the level where they synapse with the lower motor neuron and exit out through a spinal nerve. The lateral corticospinal tract, which is the one we're showing here, is made up of axons that do decussate in the medulla. The lateral corticospinal tracts conduct nerve impulses that control precise voluntary movements of the distal limbs, so our hands and our feet. These muscles are responsible for really precise, agile, highly skilled movements. So think about maybe walking on a tightrope or buttoning your shirt or playing the piano. The upper motor neurons of the lateral corticospinal tract extend from the primary motor cortex, or the primary motor area of the cerebral cortex. They then decussate in the medulla, so this is the medulla oblongata here, and then they descend down the spinal cord and synapse with a lower motor neuron in the spinal cord at the level at which it will exit throughout a spinal nerve. The corticospinal axons that do not decussate in the medulla form our anterior corticospinal tract. The lower motor neurons of our anterior corticospinal tract innervate skeletal muscles of the trunk and the proximal limbs, so like our shoulders and our hips and our thigh. These muscles produce much bigger, stronger movements, but they're not as well coordinated or controlled as our distal limbs. So it might be walking up and down the stairs or standing up and sitting down. The upper motor neurons of our anterior corticospinal tract extend from, again, our primary motor area, primary motor cortex. They run straight through the medulla on the same side. They then decussate at the spinal cord at the level that they will exit through that spinal nerve. The lower motor neurons will exit through that spinal nerve. They will innervate a skeletal muscle, and that muscle that is innervated will be on the opposite side to the primary motor area. So one side of the brain controls the muscle on the opposite side of the body. The other pyramidal tract is our corticobulbar tract. So this conducts the nerve impulses that control precise voluntary movement of the head and the neck. The upper motor neurons of the corticobulbar tract extend from our motor cortex again into the brainstem. Some of the upper motor neurons will decussate. You can see this one here is crossing over. Some will not. And the lower motor neurons exit the brainstem via 9 pairs of our cranial nerves. So 9 of our different cranial nerves that actually exit on the brainstem. The lower motor neurons will innervate muscles of the eyes, of the tongue, and of the neck. And they allow for movements like chewing, facial expression, speech, and swallowing. The extrapyramidal tracts are our motor tracts that originate in the brainstem, and they're responsible for our involuntary or automatic control of muscle. So not the voluntary muscle that we actually need to think about doing. These tracts are sometimes also called our indirect motor pathways, and they basically include all of our motor pathways except for our corticospinal and our corticobulbar tracts. So axons of upper motor neurons that give rise to our extrapyramidal tracts descend from various nuclei of the brainstem into 4 major tracts of the spinal cord. Because these tracts innervate far less muscle, and it's not the skeletal muscle that we talk about in this unit, we won't go into as much detail, but very briefly, our rubrospinal tract, one of the major functions of this tract is to modulate muscle tone, particularly when a flexor muscle contracts and extensor muscle will relax, and vice versa. So this is important for movements like, say, kicking a footy. We first want our quadriceps to contract, to extend a leg and kick the ball, but this can only happen if our hamstring muscles are relaxed. The tectospinal tract receives input from the colliculi. So remember we looked at the superior and the inferior colliculi on the midbrain in our brain in the last lecture, and this assists the reflexive movement of head, eyes and trunk in response to both visual and auditory stimuli. We have the vestibulospinal tract. So this tract is responsible for our posture and maintaining balance of the body and the head, particularly as we go to prepare for movement. And lastly, our reticulospinal tract. So this is important again for our posture, but also for controlling some of our autonomic functions. So our heart beating, changes in the diameter of our blood vessels, and our breathing rate, so our respiratory rate. Learning objective number 5 is to describe the structure and function of a reflex arc. So first, we need to understand what a reflex is. So I'm sure you've all heard the term reflex before, but a reflex is a fast, involuntary, predictable sequence of actions that occurs in response to a particular stimulus. The most important feature of a reflex is that the integration center of a reflex is not the brain, it is the spinal cord. So this is because we want a reflex to take place really, really quickly. They're generally protective. So it's much faster to transmit the information along a neural pathway that only needs to go to the spinal cord than one where the nerve impulse needs to go all the way up to the brain and then all the way back down again. So the neural pathway that a reflex follows into and out of the central nervous system is called a reflex arc, so ARC. A reflex arc includes 5 different components, and these are the 5 components here. So firstly, we have a sensory receptor. You can just call it a receptor. Sometimes this is the distal end of a sensory neuron. Sometimes we will actually have a specialized receptor that then synapses with a sensory neuron. A receptor will detect a change in a stimulus. It will then cause a graded potential, and if that graded potential reaches threshold, it will trigger an action potential along the sensory neuron. So a sensory neuron is then our second component, and it transmits that action potential, that sensory information, along the sensory neuron. Remembering the cell bodies of our sensory neurons sit in that posterior root ganglion. Third, we have our integrating center, so our integrating center down here. This is an area of grey matter within the spinal cord. In a simple reflex, it might be the synapse between a sensory neuron and a motor neuron. In a more complex reflex, there might be an interneuron, so that's what we have here, just a neuron in between our sensory and our motor neuron. But importantly, this integrating center is here in the spinal cord and not up in the brain, which is what occurs with all of our other neural pathways. Fourth, we have our motor neuron. So a motor neuron propagates an action potential from the integrating center along towards the effector. And lastly, we have our effector, which is just the part of the body that responds to that nerve impulse. So in many cases, that's a muscle or that's a gland. So again, coming back to our reflexes, if we take this as an example, this reflex is going to occur quickly, involuntary, meaning that we cannot control it, and it's going to be predictable, meaning that if the same stimulus was to occur over and over, the response is going to be exactly the same. So in this example, someone stepped on a pin, or the pin's gone into the skin, it's been sensed by a receptor, that information travels along our sensory neuron to our integrating center, back along the motor neuron to our effector, which might be to take our foot off that pin. Most importantly is the speed at which this nerve impulse travels along the reflex arc. As I said, many of our reflexes are protective, and therefore we want them to happen as quickly as possible. Now, when we talk about reflexes, we actually categorize them into several different classifications, and a single reflex can fall under more than one classification. So some of the classifications that we're going to look at today are the development of the reflex, the processing site, the nature of the response, the side of the body, and the complexity of that neural pathway. So looking at the development of a reflex, some reflexes are inborn. They occur naturally in our body. These reflexes we call innate reflexes, or we can have acquired reflexes. So this is a reflex that needs to be learned. An innate reflex could be something like the palmar grasp reflex in babies. So when you stroke the palm of a baby's hand and then they grab around your finger. There is also the rooting reflex. So you stroke the side of a baby's mouth and they will turn their heads and their mouth towards that finger, thinking that your finger will be a nipple or a bottle and they will receive food. So these reflexes are protective because they provide the baby with actions that promote their survival or promote their development. We can also have innate reflexes in adults. So this can be something like the withdrawal reflex. So an example of the withdrawal reflex is when you touch something hot and your hand withdraws really quickly before you even realize that the thing that you touched was actually hot. So it happens before you even think about it. An acquired reflex is something that we learn and over time becomes a reflex that just happens without us needing to think about it. So for example, riding a bike becomes a reflex as we become more proficient at it. Salivating when you smell a particular food is a reflex. Or slamming on your brakes in the car when someone comes out in front of you. Regarding the processing site, a reflex can either be mediated by a spinal nerve or a cranial nerve. So although the cranial nerves do technically arise from the brain or the brainstem, because the neural pathways of these reflexes don't actually go up to higher regions within the cerebral cortex, they remain within the cranial nerves, they are still considered a reflex. So an example of a spinal reflex is the withdrawal reflex, which I just talked about, so touching something hot and then pulling your hand away really quickly. This reflex takes place in the spinal nerve that innervates your arm or your hand and the body part that you touch that hot object with. An example of a cranial reflex is when you blink in response to a bright light or when someone touches your eye. Also, the reflexive action of your eyes reading along a line of words on a page. And these take place in our cranial nerves that control the muscles surrounding the eyes. The nature of the response relates to the type of effector involved in the reflex. So a visceral reflex involves a glandular or a non-skeletal muscle effector. So these reflexes include those that are carried out in internal organs, so it could be the heart, the blood vessels, or structures within the gastrointestinal system. Our somatic reflexes involve skeletal muscle. So an example of a visceral reflex is when the smooth muscle around the iris of your eye will dilate or get bigger if you shine a bright light in your eye. There's also the release of your internal urinary sphincter when your bladder becomes full. So it just automatically releases as part of a reflex when your bladder is full. Luckily, we have our external sphincter, which allows us to actually control the release of the bladder. An example of a somatic reflex is the stretch reflex. So although I'm not really sure that this happens in real life that often, I'm sure in movies and TV shows you've seen the doctor tap on a person's knee and the leg will kick out. This is called the stretch reflex, and we're actually going to talk about that specific reflex in a second. We can then have different sides of the body involved in a reflex. So a reflex can either be ipsilateral, which means same side. The receptor, sensory neuron, motor neuron, and effector are all on the same side. Or contralateral, where the receptor and the sensory neuron are on one side, and the motor neuron and the effector are on the other side. An example of an ipsilateral reflex is the tendon reflex. This is another reflex that we're going to look at in more detail in a few slides' time, but it occurs as an example when you pick up a really heavy weight. Your muscle is trying to contract against that heavy weight and it puts a lot of force through that respective tendon. In response to the force going through that tendon, the contracting muscle will relax and you tend to drop the weight to avoid any damage to that muscle or the tendon. Because the receptor is in the tendon and the effector is the muscle, all on the one side, this reflex is considered ipsilateral. An example of a contralateral reflex is the crossed extensor reflex. An example of this is when you say step on a piece of Lego and it hurts your foot. You pull your foot back, but you need to then straighten your other leg so that it remains on the ground and you don't fall over. So pulling your leg back on one side, the side that has the receptor and the sensory neuron, but then also extending your leg on the other side, so the motor neuron and the effector is on the contralateral side of the body. Lastly, we have the complexity of the circuit. So a reflex can either be monosynaptic or it can be polysynaptic. So mono means one, poly means many. So in a monosynaptic reflex, which is this one here, there's only two neurons, 1, 2, and one synapse. So going directly from a sensory neuron to a motor neuron. In a polysynaptic neuron, there is more than one synapse. So here we have our sensory neuron, we have a synapse, we have an interneuron, we have another synapse, and we have our motor neuron. And so lastly, and I know again this is a bit of a longer lecture, unfortunately the brain and the spinal cord are very, very complex, but lastly we have learning objective number 6, which is to provide an example of a reflex. So firstly we have a stretch reflex, which causes contraction of a skeletal muscle in response to stretching of that muscle. So this reflex is a somatic, monosynaptic, ipsilateral spinal reflex. So stretch reflexes is that one I talked about before when you see the doctor tapping, say, on a tendon. You can do this at the elbow, the wrist, the knee, and the ankle joints. But let's just use the knee as this example. So firstly, we have the hammer tapping on this tendon. By tapping on this tendon, it is stretching this quadriceps muscle. Our receptor is a muscle spindle in that quadriceps muscle, and it detects that change in muscle length. So it detects the stretch in that muscle. In response to being stretched, a muscle spindle generates one or more nerve impulses that then propagate along our sensory neuron through the ganglion into the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, which is our integrating center, the sensory neuron synapses and then therefore innervates a motor neuron, so that's this one here. That nerve impulse travels along our motor neuron. It tells our effector, which is the same muscle, our quadricep muscle, to contract, and that contraction counteracts the stretching of the muscle spindle. So we have a muscle that stretches too far. The reflex then causes the muscle to contract so that we don't overstretch the muscle. This is an example of a simple reflex. However, this stretch or reflex can also be quite complicated or more complex depending on the area of the body in which it takes place. So here again we have our muscle spindle. It detects the change in muscle length. That information travels along our sensory neuron. And here, alongside going to the motor neuron going back to the quadriceps, we're innervating an interneuron and another motor neuron, which is now going to our quadriceps muscle, telling our hamstring muscle, telling our hamstring muscle to relax so that our quadriceps muscle can contract. So you can see how sometimes the antagonistic muscle, which is kind of like the opposite muscle, it might be your bicep and your tricep, or your quadricep and your hamstring, they'll need to do the opposite for the effector to actually have the required effect. Now, depending on your degree, you might become quite familiar with a muscle spindle. So a muscle spindle is a stretch receptor, and it's found within the intrafusal muscles of a skeletal muscle. So our muscle spindles are these bits here that are wrapping around these intrafusal muscle fibers. So it's just the fibers on the very inside of the muscle. The muscle spindles are typically found within the belly of the muscle, which is the thick part of your muscle, the middle part. And they're attached to our sensory neurons so that they can transmit that information relating to the stretch. The next specific reflex that we're looking at is a tendon reflex. So where a stretch reflex operates to prevent overstretching of a muscle by causing the muscle to contract, the tendon reflex works to cause muscle relaxation before muscle force or a muscle contraction becomes so strong that a muscle or tendon could be damaged. This was the example that I gave before about dropping a really heavy weight. So the sensory receptors for this reflex are called our Golgi tendon organs. They sit within the tendon of a muscle, so what attaches the muscle to the bone. And where our muscle spindles are sensitive to change in muscle length, our Golgi tendon organs detect and respond to changes in muscle tension, which put that tension through the tendon. So let's say in this example that someone is doing maybe a leg extension, they're contracting our quadriceps muscle really strongly. They've put way too much weight on the machine. That is putting pressure or tension through our Golgi tendon organ. The Golgi tendon organ is stimulated and it transmits an action potential along a sensory neuron. This is quite a complex reflex. First we will innervate an interneuron, which then innervates our motor neuron. It sends an inhibitory signal to our quadriceps muscle, telling that muscle to relax. So it will stop the force being put through our tendon. That sensory neuron also innervates another interneuron, which innervates another motor neuron, which then travels along towards our hamstring muscle, our antagonistic muscle, which causes it to contract, which allows this muscle to relax and even go into a little bit of stretch. So our Golgi tendon organs are found down here. Our muscle spindles are within the muscle. Our Golgi tendon organs are down here within the tendon. The Golgi tendon organ is a receptor for tension. So it is stimulated or it generates a graded or an action potential when there is increased force or tension, which can either be due to passive stretching of the muscle, pulling the tendon from the bone, or a really strong contraction, which again is putting force through that tendon by pulling it away from the bone. Lucky last slide, and here we're going to look at an example of a polysynaptic contralateral somatic reflex. So this reflex is called the crossed extensor reflex. It occurs, for example, when you step on something sharp, and in response to that painful stimulus, you withdraw your leg. You shift your weight onto the other foot so you don't fall over. So I gave the example of standing on a piece of Lego. So taking a look at this image, the stimulus is someone steps on a tack or a pin. It stimulates the nociceptors or the pain receptors in the foot, in the right foot. This sensory neuron then generates an action potential which propagates into the spinal cord. Within the spinal cord, the sensory neuron activates several different interneurons. These will synapse with motor neurons both on the left and the right sides of the body. So the interneurons that excite motor neurons will innervate the muscles on the right side of the body so that we can now flex this flex this leg and take our foot away from the painful stimulus. We will also cause inhibition or an inhibitory signal to go to our antagonistic muscles to allow for that flexion, so this muscle will relax. We will also have decussation of that reflex arc, so our interneuron will cross onto the other side of the spinal cord. The motor neuron will then innervate, in this case our quadricep muscles, so we can extend our leg. Our left leg is now straight, so it can take the weight of our body when we pull our right leg away. So you're pulling one foot away from the painful stimulus, and then you're hopping to stand on the other leg. So this is a great example of how a reflex can be quite complex, as in the case of this crossed extensor reflex, or it can be quite simple in the case of, say, the withdrawal reflex. So that is the end of the spinal cord and spinal nerves lecture. Thank you for sticking through these last two. I know there's lots to cover. We only have one lecture remaining for the topic of the nervous system, and then we have a bit of a break. So thanks again for listening. Any questions, let me know, and I will see you in the labs and in the virtual room.